Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Dr. Hannah Simpson. I'm a research fellow in modern and contemporary theatre at St Anne's College here with the English faculty, and I'm also one of the conveners of the Reimagining Performance Network event. We're delighted to welcome you to our Black British Theatre Today Roundtable. I'm just going to say a few brief words about the Reimagining Performance Network. We sort of exist at Oxford because we don't have a specific theatre and performance department, but a lot of researchers and scholars and students working on theatre and performance, so we sort of act as a hub to try and bring those people together. The two things that we're particularly focused on within the network are investigating some of the most significant developments in contemporary theatre, scholarship and practice, including contemporary engagement with older forms and playtexts, and bringing scholars and practitioners into conversation with each other. I say scholars and practitioners and everybody who sits on that blurry line in between somewhere. So, and if you're not on our mailing list and you would like to be, drop me an email or give me your email afterwards, because we've plenty more events coming up. So we're sort of trying to hit both aims today. We're here to talk about the state of the field in Black British theatre practice across the industry and in scholarship. And of course we've got an astonishing panel of theatre practitioners and scholars here to do so, who we're delighted to welcome. A little note about the structure of the event today. I will introduce everybody with their bios. We'll then give each of our speakers a couple of moments to introduce themselves, to give a sense of where they see their work as sitting in relation to the field, and just to give you a sense of what they're particularly interested in. At that point, we'll move into group roundtable discussion, but we will leave time at the end for audience questions. So do absolutely keep a note of your questions as we go along. So, to begin in the order in your programme, we have Winsome Pinnock on your screen, our highest tech speaker today. Winsome is an award-winning writer for stage, radio, film and television. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and alongside radio and television work for the BBC, her theatre work includes Rockets and Blue Lights for the National Theatre, Manchester Royal Exchange and BBC Radio 3, One Under with Grey Eye Theatre and Kiln Theatre, Leave Taking with Bush Theatre and Liverpool Playhouse and National Theatre, that one that I can't pronounce so I'm going to skip over it, Principles of Cartography at Bush Theatre, Chichaba at Hampstead Theatre, Cleaning Up with Clean Break, Taken with Soho Theatre, IDP with Kiln Theatre, The Stowaway Plymouth Theatre, Water with Kiln Theatre, Mules with Royal Court and the Young Vic, Can You Keep a Secret with the National Theatre, Talking in Tongues Royal Court, A Hero's Welcome Royal Court and Rock and Water Royal Court. There's nothing that Winsome hasn't done, essentially. Adjoa Ando, to my left here, is an actor, writer, director and producer, and we're delighted to say the Cameron McIntosh Visiting Professor for Contemporary Theatre at St Catherine's College. Joy is a Senior Associate Artist at the Bush Theatre, Associate Artist at RSC, and a Visiting Director and Teacher at RADA and Rose Bruford, where she's also an Honorary Fellow. Last autumn, she was awarded an Honorary Fellowship by the British Shakespeare Association. In 2019, Adjoa conceived, co-directed and played Richard II at Shakespeare's Globe, and that was the first ever company of women of colour in a Shakespeare play on a major UK stage. Further theatre highlights include playing Ulysses in Greg Doran's Troilus and Cressida at the RSC, Miss Havisham, Neil Bartlett's Great Expectations at Bristol Old Vic, Casket and Julius Caesar, Condoleezza Rice in Stuff Happens, and Serafina Pecola in His Dark Materials, directed by Nicholas Heitner at the National Theatre. You can also see her playing Lady Danbury in Shondaland and Netflix Bridgerton, as well as in Netflix's The Witcher. She will soon start filming on Shondaland, Netflix's new limited series Queen Charlotte, which is a spin-off of Bridgerton's. Lynette Goddard is a Professor of Black Theatre and Performance for Royal Holloway at the University of London. Their research and teaching focuses on contemporary Black British playwriting through the intersectional politics of race, gender and sexuality. Their book publications include wonderful Staging Black Feminisms, Identity, Politics, Performance, Contemporary Black British Playwrights, Margins to Mainstream, and Errol John's Moon on the Rainbow Shawl. They are currently working on 2 research projects, one about Black British theatre directors, processes and productions, and a project about how race is portrayed in contemporary plays through such themes as race, immigration, asylum, Black communities and police. They are also co-editing Cambridge History of Black British Theatre and Performance, the 2-volume Routledge Companion to 20th Century British Theatre and Black British Queer Plays and Performance Practitioners, an anthology of African theatre. David Gilbert looks after the development of Talawa Theatre's New Work Division, finding and nurturing new and emerging artists and writers, providing dramaturgy support and enabling theatre makers to develop new work. Recent work with Talawa includes supporting and organising online directing workshops during the pandemic. Nobody envies you that, David. Film directing as part of their acclaimed 2020 Tales from the Front Line series, and producing Talawa Firsts, a 2021 festival of new work, which springboards some of the most exciting Black writers and creative talents of tomorrow. Alongside working at Talawa, David is a freelance director and theatre maker, and work with theatre includes Kiln, National Theatre, Trafalgar and the Young Vic. Deirdre Osborne is a reader at Goldsmiths, University of London, and a visiting professor at the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, University of Arch. She's dedicated to decolonising the literary canon and decolonial pedagogy. In 2014, she co-founded the award-winning MA Black British Literature, which is the only degree globally in this field. Her critical writing spans late Victorian literature to contemporary culture through 3 conceptual models: landmark poetics, commissioning Grace Nichols' poem Breath in 2020, mother text and didactic poetics. Associate Editor of Women's Writing and Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, her current project, Exhibiting Embarrassment, Museums, Public Culture and Consequentialist Aesthetics, explores how the legacy of imperial colonial acquisition ecologies have become barometers of change in rethinking Britain's cultural institutions. Nicola Abram is Lecturer in Literatures and English at the University of Reading. Her monograph, Black British Women's Theatre, Intersectionality, Archives, Aesthetics, very deservingly won the 2021 Society for Theatre Research Book Prize. It collates a previously fragmented history of Black women playwrights and performers in Britain. The book centres on published materials held in archives of various kinds, from public institutions to specialist collections to individuals' personal papers. Nicola has also published journal articles and book chapters analysing plays by Debbie Tucker-Green, Helen Oyeyemi, Winsome Pinnock, and tracing the histories of Black and Asian art collectives in Britain. And Nadine Deller is a PhD researcher and lecturer at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama and the National Theatre. The aim of her research is to shed light on the different positions of Black women playwrights in the Black Plays Archive at the National Theatre, and to critique the way that the Black Plays Archive preserves Black women's theatre. And she's written about this in Contemporary Theatre Culture, Contemporary Theatre Review. Nadine has also worked with Gildia Chi and the Young Foundation on amplifying the experiences of global majority postgraduate researchers in higher education. In September 2020, she released a podcast on Black theatre history, That Black Theatre Podcast, in collaboration with the National Theatre Central and LAHP, and she also writes for the international film magazine Sight and Sound. We will maybe give Winsome a moment to turn on her camera, because we're now going to give each of our speakers a couple of moments to introduce themselves and discuss. Winsome, can you still hear me, and are you able to turn on your camera? Absolutely not. Winsome, can you hear me?
I can, hold on.
Wonderful.
There you go.
Winsome, are you happy to go ahead and give us a few moments of introduction?
Yeah, okay. It's always difficult for a playwright to kind of situate their own work, actually, or even to talk about it, I find. But as many of you know, I've been writing plays since the 80s, and a lot of my involvement in theatre came through following Black theatre groups when I was young, very young. And it seems to me that, of course, black theatre has changed. And one of my questions today was, what do we really mean by black theatre? Because when I started following those groups, it was theatre written, performed, directed, produced by people of colour. And I don't think that's the case today, in any shape or form, in fact. In fact, that I think is kind of a rarity these days. And that, I think, came about because at that time when you had all this, it was like a renaissance really of black theatre. I think there was some kind of thinking somewhere that theatre had arrived, that it had, that there was some degree of assimilation so that there was no need for these separate groups, which had a really powerful influence on me as a writer. For example, I used to go each year to a festival that was curated by Anton Phillips, and it was a festival of black theatre, and there were a range of plays presented from around the world. Many of them were experimental, and it was just really incredible. One of the things that that was really noticeable, however, with this black theatre movement, if you can call it that, well, I would call it that actually, it was a movement, it was very political, was the lack of female voices. And I can't actually recall many women writers a generation ahead of me. I can think of quite a few men, Michael Abenseth, Mustafa Matura, but I can't name women from that generation whom I could look to for, many performers, brilliant, strong, powerful performers like Carmen Monroe, etc. But no writers, or very few. There were writers from my generation, and of course from across the pond in America, there was a rise of the black female writer, and that was incredibly inspiring. So I saw myself as joining this movement, if you like, and then it kind of left us. It kind of dwindled away as all those theatre companies, or most of them, lost their funding, and that funding went to mainstream theatres with the understanding that those theatres would then draw in black artists, black performers, etc. And in fact, what you get a lot of cross-casting because we all think that that is a sign of progress, I think, so performers of colour get to play in these mainstream plays, but actually they're not playing themselves. And so myself and a lot of other black writers, I think our aim is to reclaim that space for the performer. And also, for me, more recently, I've been really interested that myself and other writers have become interested in writing historical plays. And that too is about kind of, making an intervention into these theatre spaces and again reclaiming our unique history that has been erased both in the theatre space and in other areas. So I'll leave it there for now, and perhaps we'll come back to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Winsome. Lynette, are you happy to go ahead?
Yeah, I am. Hi, everyone. So a lot of my stuff was in the biography, but I guess what's not said there is that I came into the theatre industry in the late 1980s, about the same time that Winston was talking there, where they had the Black Theatre seasons, and they had these annual seasons. And I was a stage manager, and I mainly worked at that time within Black Theatre companies. So I worked with Black Mime Theatre Company for quite a while. I worked with, remember Black Mime? I worked at the Tri-School Theatre. I was an ASM, I was in the Youth Theatre at the Royal Court, and I was an ASM on Winsome Pinnock's Rocking Water. That was one of my first jobs. And then I worked with Black Theatre Co-op. And then, sort of in my mid-20s, I decided to go to university, just kind of thinking about what I might do next for my career. I'll just get a degree, and I went and started a drama degree. And in that drama degree, we studied directing, we studied women's playwriting, but we studied very few, well, no black directors at all, and very few black women playwrights. And so about the second year of my degree, I took it upon myself that I was going to document the history of black women in the theatre, because of course I'd come from an industry where I had been working with black women, Denise Wong, running Black Mime, Paulette Randall, I knew of Adjua as well at the time. So to me, black women were doing great things in the industry, and I couldn't quite understand why we weren't studying them. So I sort of made it, I guess, my lifetime's work to make sure that the history, first of all, of black women's theatre is documented, and then more recently I've been looking at sort of that move from what I called in the book margins to mainstream, but that move whereby the theatres like the National and the Royal Court were being given funding to diversify their programming. And so more recently I've been kind of looking at black playwrights on the mainstream. I guess I'm always interested in black playwriting as a form of cultural memory, as a political form, as a form that interrogates our identities, so race, gender, sexuality, and theatre that kind of interrogates the experiences, I guess, that we have in the world. So particularly when it's on those mainstream stages, I'm kind of interested in how those plays work as forms of, I guess, documentation of what it means to be a black person in Britain. So that's me. I'll pass to Nadine.
I don't know if I can follow up the two intros that have just happened. Hello, I'm Nadine. I'm a PhD researcher at Central School of Speech and Drama, as Hannah said. And I guess I don't really traditionally come from a theatre background when I started, but my research is focused on the Black Plays Archive, which is a really strange, but important archival project that kind of started in 2008 at the National Theatre, where Kwame Kwei-Armah, who's now the artistic director at the Young Vic, he was an associate at the NT at the time, and he went to the Lincoln Centre in Brooklyn, I think, and he visited there and saw that there was access to lots of recordings of theatre, and black theatre particularly, and realised that wasn't really accessible in the UK. And so he comes back to the NT, he talks to the artistic director at the NT at the time, Nick Keitner, and says, well, why can't we have something like the Lincoln Centre here in the UK? And Nick's like, okay, fine. 2009, they start compiling a list of black plays that were written by black writers and produced in Britain professionally. And at first, Kwame thinks they're probably only going to get about 60 plays. That's kind of the amount he's kind of put together in his own personal archive, I guess. And it turns out there's more like 334 at the time. And that was, when they started really digging into it. Now there's something like 600 plays in the Black Plays Archive, and it's essentially it's a complex archive because it doesn't really have a body. So it's owned by the National Theatre, it's run by the National Theatre's in-house archive, but it doesn't have a physical kind of archival building associated with it. It's a digital project that aims to kind of act as more like a catalogue to give you information about black plays, their production materials, the cast, production information. But at the same time, there's a kind of a problem there. And archivists at the NT will tell you this if you ask them. but it shouldn't really be run by the National Theatre. If you look at the National Theatre's repertoire of plays, there's an extreme lacking in plays by black writers. Winsome is the first, was the first black British woman to be work to be performed at the MT. That was leave taking in 95, I think, and Mustafa Mature was the first black British man, and that was 1991 was the coup. So there's a conflict going on between the National Theatre collating this work by black writers, and also the fact that there's a history there where they haven't really been representing black work, and they continue to have a kind of a contentious relationship with it going forward. So I guess that my work, that's a kind of brief sort of introduction about the Plays Archive, but my work is looking at the archive and critiquing it in the ways that it preserves black work, and particularly black women's work. And I'm also interested in spatial politics, in which works are allowed to occupy particular theatre spaces, and what they're allowed to do in those spaces. What happens when black women enter particular cultural spaces and are allowed to create work there, and what barriers are there, and what political kind of ruptures are going on in different spaces. Spaces like the National Theatre, which is very much mainstream, and like the Olivier, which is notoriously hard to stage work on, and then more fringe spaces like some of those that Nicola talked about in her work, with theatre of black women and kind of touring companies that are able to occupy libraries and children's centres. So I'm kind of interested in those things in my work. And before I forget, I also create a podcast as a way to kind of address a kind of a gap in the way that black theatre production and knowledge around it is being reproduced. Like I'm interested in digital knowledge production, and there's a problem when we think of digital knowledge as something that is easily accessible, but also kind of ephemeral and infinite. And I suppose I'm interested in the idea that a problem with knowledge production is that in order for things to survive and knowledge to survive, it has to be reproduced. And there's a key problem in black theatre research and the way that it's disseminated in a mainstream setting is that these stories aren't being reproduced. So I guess I created a podcast to kind of try and tell some of those stories in black theatre history in the hope that they will be able to be reproduced through podcasting modes. I think that's it.
Hi, I'm Deirdre, and I guess my work has always been addressing the legacies of the British Empire, especially the imperial colonial aftermath as it's experienced unequally today in this particular nation. And it's important that I state I did grow up on the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people's lands that were unceded in Australia. And then at the top end of the continent, my Indigenous family are fluent in Kikuyu-Lanji, which is a language that has been retrieved because, of course, of the 600 language groups on that continent. It was deemed they were disappearing, dead languages, etc., when that was anything but the case. So I'm very much concerned with bringing out the submerged stories. And coming to Britain in the mid-80s, migrating here, I had the privilege of how I look, how I fitted in, so-called, to institutions and how I was read. But I've said this before, I noticed living in London, where I was lucky enough to live, the people I was seeing day to day on the streets were not those people represented on the screen in the theatre or in the bookshops. And so when I was doing my PhD, I was also head of education at Wandsworth Prison. And so friends that I knew that were starting out as who would term themselves Black British writers, Courtney Newland, my long-standing collaborator Khadija Cisse, Linton Kwesi Johnson. These people were kind enough to come into the prison and speak to classes who were primarily young black London men. And we made these inroads into the ideas around literature and reading of experiences that were not even possible to study on curriculum, and still aren't. In those days, To Kill a Mockingbird was the sole black text on the GCSE curriculum, yes. It's still there. But I was able to get Courtier's novel, The Scholar, inserted into a curriculum for that year of the GCSE that the men then were able to take. This is not about theatre so far, I'm moving to theatre. One of the things I also noticed, of course, in the National Theatre, as Lynette pointed out, about the dearth of black women when we have playwrights who are extraordinary. Only 3 black British women have had plays staged at the National Theatre still. 3! You know, this is so incredible. But that's the story that one keeps telling in terms of thinking about black British culture and cultural autonomy and cultural assertion. And so I'm very much concerned with the porousness between poetry and drama and fiction and life writing. There aren't many boundaries, and I think what I'm so honoured to be part of is a lot of writers who are working transgenerically, who are working with polyphonic voices. So I first came across Bernardina Bristow in 1997 when Lara came out, Andrea Levy reading in Brixton Library in the late 80s. You know, these women are now the pillars of the literary world as we conceive of it today. So, as Lynette was talking about what was happening, and also Winston referred to what was happening in terms of those earlier decades, why weren't women's voices being given the recognition? Beryl Gilroy published many years after she was having the experiences that she recorded, and of course, thank goodness, Black Teacher is now being reissued because Bernadine can use her position and her prominence to start restoring what have become overlooked and disappeared voices. So especially in the theatre, I've been involved in thinking about the monodrama, what that means for a black person's voice to have that virtuosity not only of performance, there is no other option except that person performing, but also in crafting the words and the experience that is represented. So I'll just name the 6 people in particular whose work I've looked at and also that I've spoken to about the work. This is not an intellectual exercise. This has always been about me making connections, and if somebody says, no, I don't want to talk to you, absolutely fine, I'll step back. But if I say, look, your work needs to be taught, I want to put it on the MA Black British Literature, that is a wonderful, I think, sense of an entry point to feeling embeddedness, to getting that longevity, because if you can't get your work revived in theatre, if it gets into the education system, there is a longevity, there is a knowledge making that accompanies that. So Lemsi Say, Sue Andy, Kush Jumbo, Patterson Joseph, Giuseppe Bushel-Mingo and Travis Alabanza. So these are 6 monodramatists whose work in particular I weave into the curriculum, and that's all I should say. Thank you.
Something to follow. Wow. My name is David Gilbert. I work at Tallowa Theatre as their sort of new work coordinator, and essentially my position there is just to oversee new talent, new writers coming into the industry. We do that through one-to-one drama development sessions. We do that via our open script submissions program, where you can submit a new production or a new play that you have, and we'll give feedback on that play. And through that, sometimes we develop relationships with those writers to maybe think about how we can help them get in contact with theatres that might be interested in that work, hopefully leading them to potentially have a production on within the industry. The main thing that you focus on is the annual playwriting festival called Tallowa First. And yeah, it's just about trying as much as possible to create platform for new voices and new writers to come into the industry. And I think for me, you know, sitting here, you know, I just always want to be in the room and be a voice in that space that potentially could understand where that artist, that Black British artist, is coming from. So that, you know, that's been my interest so far. I started off directing, but I guess for me it's about making sure that, you know, I'm a product of a grassroots project. You know, I was a young actor, wanted to engage with theatre, and that's how I got into the industry. Had no passion or, you know, I wanted to do football. And I've ended up, you know, meeting people along the way that have encouraged. So I'm a product of that, and realise that, you know, there's so many people who want to find their way into the industry, not only through the educational systems that we have, but also those who just are creative. So it's about trying to see how we can, you know, be in the gap where they have someone that they can connect to and talk to. So my interest is just like getting in the room, being a voice that can connect to those stories that may not get on that stage or may not be understood. And yeah, it's brilliant working with Tallow Theatre Company, who are a leading Black British theatre company, 35 years plus now, going strong. We stepped into radio recently. Writers who had never written for radio, we put out a call and said, hey, listen, we're in lockdown. There's the radio, and speaking to the BBC, and we managed to get 3 writers who've never written for radio to write for radio, and we put it out there. So I think, you know, Tallow are just so brilliant at trying to find ways to get people in, be a space that artists, Black British artists, can turn to and feel comfortable in. And one of those playwrights that we worked with, Sean Carter, we have now taken her play, which was a half-an-hour play, and we've developed it into a full production, which is happening at the Lyric Hammersmith, starting on the 10th of February. So I think for Tallow, it's just how do we just keep the doors open and keep coming through with being a space that artists can connect to. Not only playwrights, but we also do understand that where the work is going right now, everyone has to be multiple. So people are not just working with, you know, writing down stories. They devise. They are multidisciplinary. So we also we have a space in Croydon at Fairfield Pools, and we allow artists to use that space for research and development as well. And so it's, you know, there's basically, I'm here to just say there's so much work out here. Let's keep doing what we're doing, and yeah, it's brilliant to be a part of this panel today.
Okay, I'm Nicola Abram. A lot of my professional work Hannah has already described and got written down, but just to give a bit of a sort of personal story to that. So I started researching Black British theatre about 12 years ago, and started in the Victorian Albert Museum archives. And the journey has taken me in lots of different directions since then. And I think for me the greatest pleasures in that have been meeting some of the people who were active in the 1980s. So Theatre of Black Women has been mentioned by Wilson already. Also Manera Theatre Company. So I remember seeing in the archive, and when I say archive work, you know, I'm not looking at organised, catalogued, well-preserved material. This is sort of, you know, you're lucky if there's an archivist who comes and bring you a box, and then it's just making sense of what's in that box. The V&A is one example. It is obviously much more of a formal institutional archive. And while I was in there very early in my research, I saw this newspaper clipping that mentions this company, Manera Theatre Company, and I just thought, wow, this sounds interesting. I'm doing a project in Black British women's theatre. I wish I could find out more. And 10 years passed, and with asking people, you know, I couldn't get any more material to explore, to substantiate what I'd seen, what I'd sensed about their significance. And it was only a couple of years ago that I was able to make contact with members of that company through Bernadine Everester, who was one of the co-founders of Theatre of Black Women. And the pleasure for me of talking with people and kind of receiving the generosity that they showed me in sharing those materials of their own that they kept in personal archives has really just been such a joy and such an honour in my work, and it's wonderful to be able to sort of bring some of that to people in the work that I published. Most recently, my first book. So yeah, the pleasure of that has been significant for me. But I think also what's really mattered to me in researching Black British theatre is the relationship between politics and aesthetics. So particularly in the 1980s and early 1990s, the sort of the daring to say things as they were, to speak truth to power, to show Britain what it really was. I see that in the work that I've found in the archives, and I'm so drawn to that. I love the energy of that. And that relates, I think, to the aesthetic innovations that I see in the archival material. This kind of daring to break the forms that are established in British theatre, to do something that might seem different to a conventional, mainstream theatre audience, but that has itself a kind of a lineage in terms of Black theatre aesthetics. So that's what I love about the work that I've been able to do. I feel odd being here in lots of ways, not least because I've been to talks that Winston has given. I've admired the work that various practitioners and scholars before me have done. So it's strange to be up here, but it's also something that kind of matters to me personally, I guess, having grown up in the 80s and seen a small part of the world, to come across through my research a different kind of story, a different kind of narrative about the nation, and one that I think must be told and must be heard. So that's, I guess, what my work is doing. But today is about Black British theatre today, so I feel kind of out of place in that my research is very much archival and historical, so hopefully I can bring some of that perspective to our conversation.
Hi, I'm Angela Ando. I'm long in the tooth. I did my first professional job in 1984 at the Oval House and the Drill Hall and Acton Community Centre, and it was a play written by a black woman, and it did have a cast of all black women, and I don't think it's in anybody's book. So it's a theatre company called Akimbo, Deborah John Wilson. So I suppose, what do I think about that? I think we need to be as forensic as we can about our archiving, because as Nicola says, a lot of it is in somebody's shoebox in the wardrobe, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't a full production at some point. And the reason that, if we want to talk about black theatre today, we have to talk about that theatre is because that legacy gives theatre makers today and audiences and everybody involved with it a sense of ownership, a sense of lineage, a sense of belonging, and a sense of the rightness of being involved in making the work that they do to reflect the voices that they want to be heard. So I'm interested to know why you guys are here today. I'm interested at how we communicate. I'm interested in the lens that we hold. Why are there not more people of colour in this room? Why? This is not an academic intellectual exercise. This is somebody's life. This is the narrow line on which you navigate your world through the stories that you see that are told about you, about the world that you live in, and the lens through which you see the world. So, a couple of years ago, I did a show, as we spoke about. I did a production of Richard II at the Globe. I went to see Michelle Terry about doing Richard III, which I am going to do next year at the Rose in Kingston. And I talked to Michelle and I said, I want to do this production. She said, well, you can't do Richard III, you can have Richard II. I want Richard II. I like it. I'll do. And it was going to be on during the Brexit, the big Brexit vote. It's a play about England. It has the great paean to this sceptred isle, the great love letter to the island. It talks about who has a right to be a citizen thereof and who doesn't. It felt like a perfect play to be doing during the Brexit debate. And, you know, nothing happens in a vacuum. Theatre talks about the zeitgeist. That's why Shakespeare is so fabulous, because you can always find the zeitgeist in Shakespeare. So I wanted to say this island only exists because of the contributions, centuries long, of the people who have been done unto elsewhere and brought here, which is us. Colonisation, it's power, it's capitalism, it's all of those things. And so the way we shaped that conversation was to say, we will do you fantastic production of Shakespeare. Every beat will be hit, every punctuation, every emotion will be run, and we will do it with women of colour. See, in my day, black meant of colour. So it wasn't African heritage, it was of colour. It's a political term. So when we did our Richard II in 2019, for me, I'm speaking back into going to the We Are Here conferences in the early 1980s, where I met my best friend, Jackie Kay, who was the Poet Laureate of Scotland, the Macca, where I met a number of brilliant women of colour who wanted to write, to direct, to make films, to write poetry, to compose, to choreograph dance, who just wanted to speak. So it's making me a bit emotional. Wanted to speak creatively. So, you know, Winston knows all that history as well, as does Lynette, because we grew up in it. It sort of framed us, it shaped us. It was the conversations that we spoke. We only read women authors. We only read women of colour authors, because it was like we needed a big pushback to flip us into a space where we knew we existed, that we had stories of value that were worth telling. And then we honed our craft, because you have to be really good at what you do to earn that space. You know, it's the thing that I was having a conversation with my friend earlier. You know, it's the immigrant, it doesn't matter where you come from in the world, you have to be twice as good as them. You have to. You know, that's the line that goes with everything. And so, you know, we all have honed our crafts, and we want to celebrate that craft to encourage the next generations to come forward. So I would say, women playwrights, Ethel Sutherland, Ama Ata Edu. These are Ghanaian women who were writing in the 1960s, writing radical, feminist, anti the norm of the cultures they grew up in material. And we don't know about them anymore. You know, I was in one of Winston's plays at the Bush recently, Leave Take. Well, it wasn't even recently, was it? 2016, 17. Because if you, quite often you will find that writers of colour, black writers, they're doing new writing, it gets done once and then it gets parked. So we were part of a season that the Bush did about bringing back plays that had been done before. So things are hiding in plain sight. Jackie Kay wrote a play in the 1980s called Chiaroscuro, for Theatre of Black Women. She wrote a play called
Twice Over.
Twice Over, thank you. I was in it. Thank you, Lynette. The Gay Sweatshop. You know, so you might not find that black play if you're looking in the black, but if you look in the Gay Sweatshop archive, you'll find it in there. So it's like, you need to look around. There was a fantastic theatre company called Timber. I did a play of theirs, Glory, which was about Trinidad independence, and it was also about, you know, priests abusing the children of their parishioners, all in one story. Who knows that play now? It was a smash hit, but as we were saying, those companies, their funding got cut, they were supposed to be subsumed into the mainstream of theatre, and then the call goes out, we've done our black plays this season. Thank you. Correct. Because you know, it wasn't part of the conversation, it was an adjunct to do the brainwashing, as I call it. So always beware of brainwashing. It's a real thing. all of these conversations end up being about the lens through which you see the world, the levers of power, and who has access. So how do we communicate that this afternoon is happening to a wide audience? You know, you have to think about the invitation. When you do a theatre show, who do you advertise it to? Where do you advertise? When you were writing a novel and you say, the man came through the door and saw that black woman, immediately I know you're a white writer. Okay, it's what is the lens if you want? You know, it's such a broad canopy that we have to engage with at all times, and it demands a certain focus and alertness and a determination to be skillful in all we do. But we have to talk to each other. We have to be as rigorous, as dense with the work that we do, as the research that we do, as the archiving. Where do we put the archive? It's absolutely the point about the Black Theatre Archive at the National is absolutely the point. Why do they have it? Because they have power, and the writers of those plays do not. How do we have that conversation? It's not just about how do you do a show. I could talk to you all afternoon about lighting skin of colour. You know, the lighting is set up to light white skin. It doesn't matter if it's on stage or on TV or in movies. So it's like we have to reframe all of that to go, no, we have to light all skin. Your voice coach needs to do they need to know all the accents, because, you know, I can do a West Country accent, I can do a Ghanaian accent, I can do a Russian accent, I can do it, because I have to know all those skills, but not everybody has to know all those skills, so we have to broaden the conversation in all aspects. But fundamentally, we have to broaden the invitation of who thinks they have a right to be engaged with the art of storytelling in its many ways. And that's about commissioning. We don't need, frankly, we do not need lots more training schemes. We need access. We should do the work. We're jolly good. We're not too. We just need to give us the space in which to do the work. Crews backstage. We need more stage management, as the net used to be, but we need more researchers to also pay. But we need, you know, all of that. We need the whole panoply, because so I'll be very quick and I'll stop. One of my kids is trans. When that child transitioned, the person that they became resonated as exactly the same as the person they had been before. Their fleshy overcoat, as I call it, was different. And I think that about all of us engaged in this work. Every person in this room is a unique soul, with a unique journey and a unique lens, and we have to meet each other, and we have to make work that says, you are welcome.
Well, short of just going home now, I want, picking up on this note of needing to meet and to talk to each other. If perhaps beginning with our practitioners, and Winston, that's your 2-minute warning, to take a step back and perhaps think about what it is about the theatre medium specifically that has sort of gathered, drawn everybody in here. Particularly since, if we have you here as practitioners who have moved across various media, you're not one-trick ponies in that sense, but something is bringing you back to theatre, or something that is potentially useful to talk about as a specific medium there. I wonder if perhaps to begin, if Winsome is happy to talk to that, or Joa, if you're happy to talk more about the specificity of the theatre medium in that sense.
Winston's on.
Brilliant.
You're asking, sorry Hannah, you're asking why theatre?
Yes, is there something specific about the theatre medium as opposed to the other media that you've worked in that you find significant?
Well, what other media are you saying? You mean as opposed to radio?
Yes, exactly.
Or screen? Okay, well, I'll go back in time again. And the first plays I ever saw, I was about 12 years old. And there were 3 plays that I saw. I don't come from a background of going to the theatre. I grew up on a council housing estate. Not that people from council housing estates don't go to the theatre, but just that the family I was from, they're just, my mother worked for the NHS, and there wasn't, you know, that wasn't her interest. And I became interested in theatre through school. So we had these school trips to theatre, and there were 3 productions I saw. I was about 12, 13. I saw The Sea by Edward Bond at the Royal Court. I saw St Joan, all plays by male writers. I saw St Joan by George Bernard Shaw, and I saw The Taming of the Shrew by Shakespeare. These 3 productions that all had these very powerful female characters in them, even The Taming of the Shrew. This girl, in this particular production, this girl came on kicking and screaming, and to a 12, 13-year-old, there was something about that was so powerful. All 3 of those plays had, for me, a political message. And I felt that there was something exciting about the theatre, in that it was communicating something to me, and it was doing it in the most beautiful way. So the whole aesthetics of the theatre just captured my imagination, the lighting, the performances, the music, everything. But more than that they had something urgent to say, and that the performers seemed to be saying that they could make a difference, that they could effect some kind of change. And so that was my initial interest in theatre, that I thought, this is for me. This is really something, a very powerful medium. But I've also so there's so much you could talk about, but I'll just say, for example, with my last play, the way in which you can explore ideas to do with the legacies of history on stage, the way that you can dramatize that, the way that, in ways that historians can't, with all the truth that historical research carries. But as a playwright, you can try to imagine what someone from the past might have lived like, even though their history has been erased. You can make that leap of the imagination and say, well, I want to restore that voice somehow. Because there are very few, in Britain anyway, very few traces, you know, there are traces of the lives that were lost through, you know, to history. But you can use those traces, you can think, Andrea Levy talks about reading between the lines of history, and you can do that and make them real in theatre. You can have, as happens in Rockets, someone from the past posing questions, difficult questions, to someone in the present. You can, by playing around with form, create debates and conversations. And this is what I really love about theatre, that it's this very fluid, for a writer, it's so fluid. There are things that you can do in theatre that you can't do anywhere else. And I would say that playing with time is one of the most interesting to me. You know, so, and the experiments that you can undertake with theatrical form, and they are experiments, you can take risks. But also, I think, as a writer, one of the privileges of being a writer for theatre is the way in which you can sort of, well, there are the questions you ask and the way in which you can change the focus. You know, that you can change an audience's focus. And in doing that, actually, it requires almost like a paradigm shift for people to understand what you're saying when you do that, because they're so used to seeing power, for example, depicted in more conventional, traditional ways. They're so used to seeing certain kinds of people at the centre and others on the margins. And so when you flip that, it takes some new way of seeing, or you know, for people to really get, I think, what's going on. But it's, for me, that's incredibly satisfying that you can place the person of colour at the centre. For example, the play that that Adjoa mentions, Leave Taking, has as its central heroine an NHS cleaner. And that, for me, in a play that seems quite traditional in its structure, and that for me was the radical aspect of it, or one of them, that you have these, especially at the time that it was written, you know, you know, that you have these women at the centre of this play and their relationships being the main focus. I wrote a very short piece called Tituba, which again, you know, Tituba in history is the main character in the Salem witch trials. She was the one who started the whole, you know, the whole thing off. She was the main character in this history. But history, interestingly, through playwrights, the playwright Arthur Miller marginalised her. He then reinstated her when the film was made of The Crucible as a main protagonist, a main, you know, someone, you know, was proactive in what happened, who made a conscious decision to claim her, to say that she was a witch, to, you know, to confess to being a witch, and the power that that gave her in doing so, the power to destroy people around her, in fact, by also denouncing them as witches or bringing that about, you know, triggering that, you know. So I wrote about that in Tituba. So there is this, there is just, and, you know, yeah, theatre is, and that unique relationship between audience and play, you know, in live theatre is incredibly exciting. The fact that the audience creates the play to some degree. So when you get a black audience, for want of a better word, I don't know how else to put this, but when you get a majority black theatre audience watching your play, then that becomes a different kind of theatrical experience.
Lovely, thank you.
And Adjoa and David, is there something specific about the theatre medium for you two?
I like theatre because all our hearts beat together in a theatre. Theatre is, you know, we know that biologically. If you empirically stick a bunch of people in the same room watching a theatre, all our hearts will start beating at the same rate. Put a bunch of women on tour, we'll all have our periods at the same time. You know, the human body is made to be in communion. We are built for communion as an organic entity. And you get the communion of storytelling when you gather in a space together, and it can be, you know, I love panto. I love panto. I'm dying to be in a panto. It's like, it's the first theatre I saw in the village hall. I grew up in the middle of the English Cotswolds in the 1960s, which is a story all of its own, let me tell you. You know, the joy of that. And then when you go on a journey with a room full of people through the horror of someone's experience or the bizarreness, or you all just go, oh, how did they do that? Whatever it is, you know, that for me is the beauty of theatre. And as Winston says, I did a play by Roy Williams years ago called Starstruck at the Tricycle. And it was a majority African Caribbean audience. And so people go, she's behind you, oh, the grandmother coming now! And it was like a running commentary through the whole play. A, I knew the audience was completely in the story. B, you can lean into that story. And it's a joyful experience, and you will not have that if you're watching a movie or listening to a radio play or sitting around. Well, you will have it if you're sitting around the telly, but it will not be one that's a flowing conversation. And I remember I had a very posh agent there who came up to me after and said, "Darling, this is like that every night." So there's something flesh and blood about the theatre, and you will, that performance, you will never get that performance on another day. When I'm doing a live show and I clock someone in the audience and I go and I do the line to them, you won't get that if you come tomorrow night because they won't be there and I might not be in the mood. Do you know what I mean? It's thrilling. Theatre's thrilling. The first play I saw was The Tempest. Arthur Lowe, Captain Mannering, was playing Prospero. I have no idea what happened in the production, but I saw Captain Mannering in the flesh and blood on the stage, and it was the most. I was 7 and I was thrilled because he was there in the flesh and he was saying these amazing words in this weird play I was watching. So that's why I like doing theatre still. I just had a sudden thought about the term black theatre because I remember my cousin from Ghana going to study medicine in America, and he was like, "I didn't know I was black till I came here. Because where I'm from, I'm a fancy boy from Cape Coast." So it's also that thing that we have to understand that this term is one that we use and we lean into because we are not the majority community. So we're making our own derivation. And even that derivation is, it's all a fiction. It talks about relationships of power, and I think we need to think about that all the time when we're doing the work. Something else I would just say, this is particularly for playwrights, is that I direct shows at Rose Bruford, I direct shows at RADA. I make a point of being on audition panels when I can, so that people can come into the room and know that they're allowed in the room. We have a dearth of plays written specifically for mixed race casts. It's really difficult. You can have your all African heritage play, your all Iraqi heritage play, your all, South Indian heritage plays. You can do, yes, and we're doing that work. But, look at this country. This country is fabulously interesting. Someone with your heritage. We've all got different heritages, and in order to have plays that authentically allow us all in, there needs to be more plays written for that broadest of audiences. And I don't mean plays where you just chuck people in. I mean plays that are written with that specificity in mind. Because actually that is the real life. You can have a best friend, from down the road whose family have lived in this area of the Cotswolds and me for bajillions of ages, or that kid who came because his parents fled Germany before the Second World War, or that family that came across when the wall came down and they got the hell out of where it was in Middle Europe, or the Africans, or the Asians, or the Caribbean, that is the life that we live today, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and we need to see that. I think we need to see more of those plays, because when I'm directing a cohort of students, you don't get to pick. I want to be able to put them in a play that they can all own in some way. And that's not to say that we can't be other people, because, my mother was white and from Liverpool. That's also part of my heritage too. And we want to lean into everything. I suppose the last thing I should just say is I'm going to be the visiting chair of drama, Cameron McIntosh visiting chair of drama here, 2022 to 2023. I want to do a lot of work, have lots of conversations with people. I want to interact with, I want Tallowa to come and talk here. I want people to go to Tallowa to talk to you guys. I want people to talk amongst themselves, say what they want to do. So I'm just saying to you now, friend Judith here has got a piece of paper, and if you are interested, engaged, or would like to know what we're doing, until we get something up and running on the St Catherine's website, where you'll see my big face and information about what we're doing, if you just stick your email address there if you're interested, and we'll be in touch with you when we know.
I think just to quickly say, I think ultimately it's, we're all walking stories. We're all, living out our stories. And, that ultimately is the reason why we want to go to the theatre, why I want to go to the theatre. What really gripped me was I had the power to finally question for the first time. I didn't really do it at school, but when I was in a company of actors, we're looking at this play, this character, this situation, we were able to kind of question it from multiple perspectives. And I just, wow, this is amazing. And that could mean that, but it could also mean this. So I think for me, theatre is important, and many art forms do this, but we go sit in front of that stage and we acknowledge that this is us, we exist. It's a moment for us to kind of step out of ourselves and go, oh wow, yes, I get that. I'm so in that moment. Or oh my gosh, I didn't know about this. This is brilliant. Why haven't I heard of this before? So I think it's beautiful, it's powerful because it allows us to question ourselves. And it allows us to acknowledge that we're actually here living this life. So, with Talaga, it's just ultimately just going to those writers. What is it you want to say? And we will work with you to get that thing that's on your chest, that's in your heart, out there in the world. So, it's all about the story.
I wonder if we might think a little bit more about that term, black theatre, black British theatre, because certainly, if Tallow identifies as a black theatre performance, it's something that I think that all four of you have sort of taken on or grappled with in various ways with your own writing. Deirdre, even your MA having that specific name of black British literature. I'm wondering how perhaps as scholars you've sort of dealt with needing a term that is perhaps not exactly the right one for various reasons, but that you've utilised.
As I said, I came out in the industry and I knew black theatre, and for me it was theatre of people of African Caribbean British descent, and that includes black and black mixed race. And then, of course, as you were saying there, the kind of black with a capital B, which I use now, which is political black, although I only write about African Caribbean heritage theatre, I don't write about Asian theatre, but I teach across black and Asian theatre, recognising that there's kind of shared experiences. But as someone who came into the industry to black theatre, I've adopted the term, and I'm quite happy to use the term black theatre. I'm a professor of black theatre and performance, but I don't always think of myself, I'm a black person. Again, you kind of said that. It's not like I'm walking around going, I'm a black professor of black theatre and performance. Yeah, I'm black. But that's just, that just comes along with that's just the fact, right? But for me, when people will say, like when I was coming up with my professor title, people were saying, why do you want to be a professor of black theatre and performance? Doesn't that just make it a bit niche?
Oh, no.
Isn't that just sort of narrow? Why don't you just be a professor of theatre and performance? And I was like, well, there are professors of Shakespeare, and there are professors of 19th century literature, there are professors of all different things, and black theatre for me is a genre among many genres. So in a way, I'm a professor of contemporary British theatre with a particular specialism on theatre that is written by black writers or directed by black directors. So in a sense, I bring the black into the So I'll often go to conferences that will be about, I don't know, whatever the theme was. Let's say asylum. That's one of the ones that I've attacked recently. So it's a conference that's about asylum, and there's no kind of recognition that actually black playwrights have been writing about immigration and asylum since the 1950s. So at these conferences, they'll be like, this is about contemporary British theatre and asylum, and there'll be no representation of black stories were I not there. You know, so I'm quite happy to kind of think about black as a genre among many genres, and as a genre that needs to be included in these debates about British theatre. So that's kind of how I see the term, and politically as well.
In terms of black British literature, you know, Lynette is one of the lone trees on the hill, as my dad would say. My colleague Joan Animata was the only professor of the only British professor of literature in the whole of the UK in the English department. We have a seismic gap of a generation of scholars who would term themselves black British scholars, whether or not their specialisation is in romanticism or the contemporary novel, for example, because the generation that Joan represents, who made inroads into the academy, have retired, but there was no system of nurture that would then produce the early career and what should be now mid-career scholars who are of African Caribbean descent. And I specifically say that because, to a lesser degree, and I'm again using this obnoxious umbrella term, British Asian scholars have found more of a space in which to be generalists within the academy. So I feel that something like Black British Literature, Joan and I were committed to saying this is in a way Marsha Hunt the Sagar Prize, recognising the generations born in this country who didn't have the migratory sensibility of having come from outside Britain, were growing up in Britain, and as Carol Phillips said, he could only turn to urban stories from the United States in order to try and make sense of what was happening to him. And so this sense that work that is created by people born in Britain who term themselves Black British was very important to establish as a critical field. Paul Mendez, who's one of the students on the MA, author of the award-winning wonderful Rainbow Milk, he talked about the critical edge that needs to be brought to criticism because the field of theatre and literary studies is dominated by white scholars. And we have this in the classroom all the time. I say, okay, we're studying leave-taking, or we're studying Urki by Khadija Cissé, or whichever play or poetry or novel we're studying, but overwhelmingly the essays you're going to read to sort of fuel your then own distinctive approach to the work is going to be by someone who's European, is going to be by someone from the United States, etc., because the networks existed where those scholars can zoom in and very easily get access to the voice that's needed, the means of publication and so on. And so that's why Black British Literature as a title is so important for this MA. And for 8 years, I say this, every summer I used to have to fight at the institution who wanted to close it down, notwithstanding during the Black Lives Matter protest, which, thank goodness, now they have decided they want to support it. But when Joan suddenly retired, I was left without my senior collaborator because it was important that Joan, as a black woman, was a professor and I was a reader. I was below her in the hierarchy. So the gap of young scholars, we tried with our MA to start that momentum, to get the next generations in there, because it is really, really hard when you have a room full of 100% black students, as the MA Black British Literature has. I am the only white person in the room if I'm teaching a particular module. And the cultural edge, as Paul calls it, that is needed in the work in terms of how we critique it and examine it and experience it in the academic environment, I must say.
I just want to add one other thing onto that, actually, because as Deirdre was talking, she was reminding me of, there was a story that someone told me ages ago around a course on contemporary British theatre. So they designed a course on contemporary British theatre, but when they taught it, they only taught black work on it. But the course was called Contemporary British Theatre, rather than what I call my course, Contemporary Black British Theatre, Theatre, Race and Activism, right? And so when this person stopped teaching the course and they handed it over to someone else, suddenly this course was populated with no black plays. Contemporary British theatre, read white plays. And I said, you see, that's why I put black in the title of my courses. That's why I put race in the title of my courses, because if it's there in the title and in the validation of the courses, it can't be removed, right? Whereas if you say contemporary British theatre and someone comes in, they can teach whatever they want. So for me, it's important to kind of name it for that reason as well, to make sure that it can't be removed.
I mean, Nadine, again, in terms of naming, it's something that's at the forefront of your podcast. How important was that as a decision?
It's really important. It's so important because you're acknowledging the space that you're occupying and the space that's been there before. Like, I'm mixed race, I identify as black mixed race. My mum's black African, my dad's white from Wembley, and those are two really important parts of my identity. But I don't come from a theatre background, as I kind of said. I come from like a literature background, and there was a severe lacking, as Deirdre kind of said, there's a severe lacking across the board of being black and being taught by black professors, black lecturers, and when I discovered black theatre and started my PhD, it really felt like coming home. And I think part of the importance of naming is that you're acknowledging a lineage that is not always acknowledged, and you're acknowledging that there isn't a line of kind of first times. So I think that when we talk about, not here, but in a more mainstream kind of setting, black theatre can often be kind of touted as like a long line of firsts, rather than a kind of ongoing kind of rich lineage that needs to be kind of excavated and turned back to. That's why it's so important that we do keep looking back to the past. But the term black in itself, like the Black Pays Archive, the way that they archive their work is that they kind of note that black can be a term you use strategically, politically, and to ethnic and racial identities, but it is I think it's a political term, and I use it politically, but I think it is important to use in order to kind of to ensure that space is carved out. Because kind of, as Lynette was saying, like if you take that term away, it can mean that there's an opportunity to push us back to the side again. So I think it is really important.
I mean, Nicola, certainly that excavation of the lineage is right up your street, but I mean, the grappling with that term is something that you do very directly in your book as well.
Yes, and in teaching, as Lynette has mentioned, and people have experienced, and as well. There is something about the titling as kind of speaking to an audience and as kind of calling people in, and not just in terms of what texts are represented, but about who comes to that class as well. I think that really matters. I think for me, my use of the term is guided by the people I've spoken to, the playwrights that I've worked with, and it's interesting to see how over the years terminology and self-naming has evolved. So yeah, in the 1980s, it's sort of the political, capitalised, collective black, and then that seemed to evolve into, particularly sort of later in the 80s and the 90s, the kind of more fragmented, sort of separatist kind of naming. And then more recently, it's interesting to see how that capitalised political black has come back into usage, particularly in recent years in the wake of Black Lives Matter. So I think telling the stories and the histories of these terms is really important. I try to make that part of my conversation in teaching. And I think what we are sort of getting to here is about this relationship. That you use the term mainstream in your writing. I think several people have talked about this idea of kind of the mainstream, sort of the centre stages, the big theatres and stuff. And it is a question of representation, isn't it? Of the challenges of kind of wanting visibility, but then being absorbed and appropriated and in effect then silenced and hidden again. So I think that challenge persists. I find it useful, Gayatri Chakraborty-Spivak uses this term strategic essentialism, and I find that a kind of an enabling concept, that we use terms strategically in order to be able to say there are this many players, playwrights, professors, whatever. But at the same time, that doesn't mean the terms are sheltered from questioning and from conversation. I think we have to do both.
Just speaking into that, the thing about quantifying, it's really important. When we did Richard II, I said everybody involved in this production is going to be a woman of colour. So if you're the site director, or the costume supervisor, or the composer, or the musician, or the voice coach, or the press officer, or the photographer, everyone was a woman of colour. And, a pretty right-on theatre, dreadful pushback about that. And why do you need to do that? Or can we have one white actor on stage? No. Could we have a black man on stage? Women, every woman on stage. And because it's the bottom of the heap. So the bottom of everybody's heap is the woman of colour. And to just say, I can get you a woman of colour to fill every role professionally in the theatre, assistant director, so all the stage management, lighting designer, everybody, woman of colour. Because it's like you have to put the marker down and go, we are here, we are professional, we are capable, we just need the job. So, make space. And if the ordinary lord thing, his master's house will not give away his master's power. It's that thing you have to take this, you have to literally take the space. And whether it's by saying there's this many, or by keeping the term black in the thing, or reclaiming the term black, or having a very specific course that does that, or asking for the stories from the heart that have not been heard. We have to take up space. The space that we feel and then get squished out of. We have to squish back in.
Because so many black practitioners are multi-practitioners. Someone's already said that as we've gone around. So why aren't there more stage managers and designers? Why are we not seeing people? Because many people did writing, directing and design and stage management back in the day.
But the institutions were formed under the British Empire and they have not been reformed, chipping away at the bedrock, and you get some sort of like the inroad that you just described, but fundamentally there's a really quick regrouping and a default position. It's easily achieved because it's about institutions, which of course many conversations have been had about that more intensely in the last few years.
We're going to open up to audience questions now. We have time for a couple. Just stick your hand up and then project, please. And if there are questions specifically for Winsome, I will relay to make sure that she gets them as well. And certainly, I should say, if our speakers want to pose questions more broadly to the audience and to each other, absolutely, there is space for that as well. Sauce, and then in front of Sauce.
Can I ask anything about cross-casting and what you think happens in the performance, what we're looking at, what's there?
What do you mean by cross-casting?
Cross-gender casting, cross-racial casting, also, and it's become, in some ways, a way, whether it's politically a kind of stop, a way of not telling other stories, but seeding in, allowing space for some other bodies on stage, but also when, I think it was Lynette who said that that's a sort of erasure of who we are. Your cross-racial casting is sort of erasing the actor's identity.
I think when Winsome said it, yeah.
I didn't take good notes. So, if that's an erasure, what's happening in any of your view, in whether examples of that, what are the dynamics of it?
Yeah, Winsome said it.
Winsome, do you want any of that detail relayed?
Yes, please. I didn't hear the question.
Yes. So,
Thank you.
Sol's question was picking up on this idea of cross-casting, and particularly this idea that is there a form of erasure going on in cross-casting if we're not speaking to specific identities there, or what exactly is the dynamic that is happening on stage whenever you get that non-specific cross-casting?
Well, I think it's not, the answer isn't straightforward as with most things, because of course you want everyone to have the opportunity to play. You want actors of colour to have the same opportunities as any other actor, to be seen for a wide range of roles. And I can understand that, there might be a fear of being typecast or limitations of being cast in the same kind of role all the time. But my concern actually is, you should perhaps ask an actor or a performer about this specifically, because my concern about it is does cross-casting cover up for the fact that there are fewer plays by black playwrights being produced? Because, so that's my question, is that, if the Arts Council gets its sort of returns at the end of the year, where you say, well, how many artists did you employ? You can say, well, we had this many people of colour employed by us, these artists, but how many of them are writers? Because writers it's very limited, but they have some degree of power to effect change on that stage. And so that's really what interests me. Well, it's not the only thing that interests me. It is also about telling very specific stories, retrieving specific histories. And these are all quite complex issues, I think, actually. And I from my experience, performers and writers can sometimes have different agendas where this particular issue is concerned. And I do respect, the issues that performers have. Speaking as one writer and not speaking for other writers, I would like to see more plays by black writers being produced on stage by a diverse, black writers writing. Well, they can write anything they want, but I would like to see them writing for black performers. And the cross-casting thing, the other thing, someone once told me that when it comes to, this is why Adjoa's production was so beautiful, it was amazing. Someone once told me that often when producers use cross-casting, that black performers find themselves playing the same role, so that role becomes a black role. I can't pick specifically which role it was, but do you see what I mean? It's a bit like the gay friend in the old rom-coms that used to be on in the 90s or whatever, that they take on these essentially marginalised roles that are played, that come to be seen as traditional roles for black performers. So that's one of the, so that's is a challenge, I suppose, of cross-casting.
It's hilarious. So the latest, just speaking to that, Winston, the latest traditional black role is the therapist. It used to be the judge, now it's the therapist. So, you're there, you look like you've got status, but you have no narrative arc within it. You look everywhere at the moment. I had a friend from South Africa say, yeah, I've got this new show that I'm writing. It's about this police officer, and I'm just an amazing part for the therapist. And I was like, for me? No, I'm just going to give you a list of shows and then go away and maybe rethink your story. So it's absolutely those tropes happen. I'm really interested in black writers writing for multiracial casts. I remember in the 1980s, so there was a family on EastEnders called the Taverniers.
Yes.
The
That's why I came
Taverniers
into
called the
theatre.
Taverniers because I wrote the brief for that family, because my friend was the script editor, and my best friend who I'd come up from Bristol with was Carol Tavernier. So obviously I wrote an older sister, and then they changed it to an older brother, so I was writing myself. And then I went into EastEnders for about a year after that, as the first singer in the Queen Vic. While I was there, I was just saying, where are the, you've got this black family, where are the black writers? Oh, we get them in to write for the shape of the black family, and then we get people in to do the rest. Because the absolute thought was black writers can only write the black storyline. And what people don't understand is that if you're in a society where you are the minority and you have to navigate everything, you know everybody's story, because you have to or you can't survive. You have to know when the shit-eating grin needs to come out, when you can go in a corner and talk to somebody you trust. You have to navigate the world in a really specific way, so you know all the stories. So I, as I was saying, I want to see more heritage bodies on the stage, and I want there to be more black writers writing those stories, because then all the voices will have some authenticity about them. I'm really interested in seeing that happen. Sorry, that's just...
I'd like to qualify what I said, because I don't think I would agree. I think I would agree with Adjoa, and I'm not saying that black writers should write all just for black performers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I agree with what you're saying, that we want to see that life that Deirdre described, seeing it on the streets in the world, reflected on stage. Yeah.
I think the cross-casting thing is a problem when we start to talk about people playing non-specific parts, and I think maybe, because different directors have done different things, right? Jatinda Verma really used the race of his cast to incorporate that into the way that the story was told, whereas some other directors might say, well, actually, we'll just play it straight and we'll ignore the race of the performer who's been cast as the prostitute. I have this story that I often tell of going to see, is it Macbeth? And Lady Macduff, only black character on stage, black woman, pregnant. In a scene, she's in one scene in the play where she's lamenting that her husband has run away and left her with a little child. And I'm a second-year undergraduate thinking, which person put that black woman on stage didn't think responsibly about their casting? And that's what happens, I think, when we get to it's non-specific. It's given the actor a chance to play a part, to be in a Shakespeare. I think it was English touring theatre company, Lyric Hammersmith. I've never forgotten it. It was 1993. And it was like, what, pardon? Yeah, brownwashing. And I was like, what are you doing? And she's pregnant. So now we've got single black mother, we're pregnant with another child on the stage. And it's like, that's the problem, I think. I think you can have colour-conscious casting, race-aware casting. And that's different.
Because I've done cross.
Yeah.
I've done lots of... Shakespeare is like easy. But I do have a... So I think there's a thought experiment that can happen with the way you stage something in that way.
Exactly.
Which is really interesting. So all the derogatory terms about race enrich the setting, keep them all in. What does it sound like? You really hear them when it's coming out of a mouth, when something derogatory about a black person is coming out of a black person's mouth and they don't blink. It makes you really think about what was that line and why was it said, and how are we all vibrating with that and then moving on. I loved playing Casca as a sort of urbane butch politician who was funny. And why not? I had a theatre company in the 1990s called Wild Iris, and we did lots of restoration comedy written by women, and we always had, actors, people like Danny Sapani, beautiful actors were in our shows back then. No mention of race was made. It wasn't pertinent to the stories, and anybody could have done it. I had no problem with that. But actually what I wanted to do, just having those people there, was say, because we were here in Restoration times, in lots, in thousands and thousands just in London. So of course. You know, and also we're coming up to the anniversary of Ira Aldridge, the great tragedian, who changed the way we do Shakespeare. A black enslaved man who got out of America, honed his craft, and changed the way we do Shakespeare. Let me say again. You know, it's good to sort of put all that stuff back in. But I do think sometimes I feel a bit like your nana, where I'm going, why have they changed that then? That's no sense. I don't know why they've done that. Because sometimes I do feel things get swapped just for the novelty of it, and I don't know why we're doing it. And, you know, and if it's important that that gender be that gender and that gender be that gender for a power dynamic, keep them like that. If you're saying something you don't want to say with race, as in Lady Macduff, for example, think about it. You can't just chuck it in, because we're all resonating with what we hear and see and how that hits us and what freight there is in that. So use it judiciously.
And one really powerful play, of course, by the brilliant Debbie Tucker-Green is Trade. 3 black actresses, what she says in her dramatis personae, will play every character. And so what Debbie Tucker-Green does with these casting specifications is create work for black actors, creates a platform wherein the virtuosity of performance is possible across a whole range of so-called subject positions. And I think that, you know, Debbie Tucker-Green is a superstar, but if you ask the average person studying drama, quite often they have no idea who she is. Now, what's going on? It's also Winsome's work. So the importance of that trajectory being absolutely sewn into the psyche of how we teach and how we carry culture forward is, you know, without words, very important.
And that has a lineage of its own. So thinking of Black Line Theatre, then this is a company. Yeah, Denise Wong as artistic director. This is a company whose practice was commonly to have 3 black women performing lots and lots of parts, and they had different, I call them case studies in my book, and I don't know if that's quite right really, but different storylines. Sorry?
Yeah, topics.
Different topics, different stories. And so you've got these 3 performers who you kind of journey with throughout the show, but you see them playing so many different roles. And I guess I'm not sure I like this term cross-casting. There's a kind of binary inherent in that I think is wrong. But what they do is very much to perform different characters and therefore different identities. And I think that does does 2 things, I think. One is saying we are here as black women performers on stage. You know, we are present, we are professional, we are proficient, you know, watch and learn and appreciate. But it also does something about saying identity is not predetermined. It's not just known by the body, because you see these bodies doing different identities on stage. So I think that kind of then was taken up by Debbie Tucker-Green in her more recent work. But it has a fascinating history.
The thing is, though, that because it's the black body that is used in that way, it can be disconnected from its own history. So you can, when you get a lot of this work, you can start to think, well, this is a body that you can just place it, you can locate it in all these different, you know, within all these different spaces, because it doesn't have its own history. And so that's, in a wider sense, there aren't many historical plays. I often hear people will say to me as a writer, for years and years, people would say, I'm sick of seeing plays about enslavement. But when you look for those plays, they actually don't exist. Not plays on black, you know, black plays written by black British authors about enslavement have not been produced in any great number, and yet people will say, oh, I'm sick of all these plays, and you're thinking, well, what plays? Name them. name at least 10 of those plays that you've seen in the last 5 years. So history, these untold stories, you know, I think there's a real appetite amongst writers for retrieving these stories now and telling them, because they're actually finding themselves in the way that the archive is returning the legacy of, you know, the artists that we may have missed because works weren't published or whatever. And writers need them. Writers absolutely need to be surrounded by their heritage as playwrights. So it's an interesting thing that's happening, I think, that writers are rewriting their histories at the moment. You know, because there's been a few plays, you know, a few on enslavement, in fact, and but people are telling that story in new ways, in unexpected ways, and they're, you know, they're quite revolutionary, I think. So, yeah.
So my question is with the Black Planet, and it's talking about within our own community, how we can change attitudes to kind of help involvement in theatre. So me personally, I have a godfather and an auntie mum. So when I studied contemporary art there, when I went, it had to be explained to my father as it is like, I think I would like to say, it is like university, and there are some people that didn't go to their books enough to get in, and then only then can my dad go, ah! So it's things that are changing attitudes. How can we change attitudes towards training, towards education in theatre within our own communities, and why do you think such a stigma is there?
Well, I think some of it is what I was saying before, but you have to be twice as good. You know, why are you wasting your time with this acting? Yeah. You have to get a job. Have a job. But I don't just think it's the black community. I think it's working class communities. Yeah. It's any family where economies have been fragile. Yeah. You know, it's a risk. It's a punt. And we know, you know, my God, I can't tell you the number of friends I've got who work in live arts, theatre, musicians, dance, whatever, who have gone to the wall in these last 2 years because of the pandemic. So people like your daddy are going to be even more nervous at the moment because it's like, I think there's a lot of outreach work that needs to happen. People need to feel, again, it's the invitation. Yeah. You are welcome. This could be a solid career path for you. The nature of work is changing anyway. Life is much more fragmentary and mobile than it used to be. So why not let your child exercise the skill God blessed them with? That's one line I like to use. But I think also the institutions, they need to open themselves up. Yeah. You know, they need to make themselves more available. We used to do small-scale touring. We used to do shows in community centres and dinner halls and libraries and women's aid centre. You know, it's like we need to open the conversation more, so it's not mysterious. Because I have noticed that RADA, you know, RADA works really hard, and I'm very proud that they do. But I've noticed that RADA and sometimes with the cohort at Bruford's as well, that there was a period where there seemed to be a broadening of the cohort that was auditioning, and then as things got worse with austerity and now with rising costs of everything. It's starting to go back to being a bit of a finishing school for the wealthy white again. So we have to push back really hard against that to keep that door open and to say, you know, people can have an extraordinary life in this industry, and if that is their talent, we should be encouraging them in that talent and then make it possible.
Can I maybe just turn to, I mean, David, you seem perfectly placed to tackle this question.
I think what I was saying, we've got to hold ourselves accountable, hold our institutions accountable to who's being invited into the space. Something, I think it's all about the grassroots. You know, at Tallowa we've just launched a program called Tallowa Connects, which is essentially anyone from any party in this creative industry. We just hold space with these workshops that get people just to come visit the space and just know it's there. And something, you know, we've moved to Southeast London in Croydon. And you know, it's a big community there, so you know, in our team meetings we're like, right, we need to be speaking to Croydonites, so we need to be doing that, and how are we going to do that? So in particularly in my department, in New Work, we just launched a writers group for local writers who want to learn about writing in Croydon, to try and get into get into the community and have them know that there is the space is there for them. I think, yeah, we all got to hold ourselves accountable. We've got to do more. If we have to drag people to the theatre, we have to do that. We have a project called The Tide, which will be coming out in the summer, which is an outdoor piece looking at the Windrush story. So that is, you know, outdoors at festivals, you know, trying to say, okay, cool, we'll come to you in the community spaces, the shopping malls, and we'll put the work on. That is your story. So, you know, it's not an easy thing to do, you know, but I think ultimately, you know, there is an appetite. I think it's our mindset as well. You know, of course, like my dad wants to see, you know, amazing work. You know, he came to a show that I did, I assisted on at the Kiln Theatre. He left during the interval. And I spoke to him after, and he was like, that was amazing, brilliant. And I was like, Dad, why did you leave at the interval? And he was like, I thought the show was over. So at the end of the day, like what I'm saying is, you know, ultimately, we're all responsible, but I think it's our mindset. The appetite is there. Let's just get working and get people to see the work in their homes or bring them out into the market or the theatre itself as well.
We are over time, so I'm going to beg Maya, can we take 2 final questions here? And I understand if people have their own schedules, you know, absolutely come and go as you need to. But we've had 2 very determined hands. Do you want to go first?
Hi everyone, thank you, my name is my question is a bit more of a holistic one. I want to know, what would be your advice to the only black member of staff in the institution in the arts? And how I kind of break down, and being that ambitious black member of staff, but also trying not to be that person that carries everything and the whole community on their back, but you want to do the work, but you're the only one, you have to create a business case or get a case of actually how to get funding, and always have to say, and this is what I need to do this. What's the holistic advice there?
Who's your peer group outside of the institution?
Hannah, can you repeat the question for me? Sorry, because I can't hear it.
Yes, if I can do it just a second. It's the question of if you are the only black member of your institution, your arts institution, is it that your arts, your theatre institution, to sort of be there and be ambitious about your place there in your career, but not put yourself in a position where you are carrying the entire weight of your community and that representation on your shoulders in terms of sort of advice here.
We're a panel of quite often the only one in the room.
Yes.
So you're not alone, eh? You need your own peer support group of other people who are involved in the arts in some way. So you can kind of go, I'll get back to you on that. Find your people, hatch a cunning plan, come back. Now, you know, you cannot carry everything, and nor should you, because you will burn out. But you can and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's the other thing. There have been arts practitioners, black arts practitioners from time. This is kind of what this whole thing is about. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have to take the knowledge and experience from those that have come before. We're all, you know, we stand on shoulders. We say that all the time. We really have to. and we have to make our own networks, because those networks are not made for us. So somebody here must know about black arts admin networks that are available that you should be in touch with to walk alongside and be your buddies as you're going. I'm sure there will be people.
Yeah, 100%. They're online. It's called STAMP, and it's basically loads of theatre departments, literary departments coming together to talk about how they do work, how they make work. They're very transparent from there. They have like loads of different meetings that they recorded, resources on there. It's an online resource called STAMP, and loads of stuff that I really did work on what I'm doing. So definitely do that. And also, like, there is, or one thing I wanted to say was there's also like bridging as well. The concept I heard for actors, where an actor who is part of an agency creates a moment for the agency to meet writers that they wouldn't meet. So you can email out to people and say, hey, could you come and chat to my organisation about what you're doing? So this kind of bridging, sort of like what's the word I'm looking for, methodology, could be something that you could try with your art organisation. I just think it's brilliant. This is the writer who is essentially co-signed by the agency. It's like, right, you're going to meet these 10 writers you don't know about. I know them, they're sick. You need to hear what they're saying. So something like that as well could be a way of reaching out to one person who can then talk to your whole organisation.
My thing's always been about sort of staying true to the thing that you want to do inside. So, for example, I've had projects that I've wanted to design, and people say, oh no, why would you want to do that? Well, because I want to do it. So for me, it's about really just, so that thing around grant applications and stuff, you stay true to what you think is important and what you want to do and the contribution that you feel that you can make to your sector, to your discipline or whatever, and you hold true to that, and in a way just hold true to that and use that to kind of guide you, so that can guide you towards what you don't want to do or what you don't want to say yes to. The thing around burnout, since I've been made a black professor, I identify as non-binary, but I'm the only black woman professor in drama. And suddenly, you know, it's like, oh, can you come and sit on this panel about this? Can you do this? Can you do that? And it's like, well, no, I can't, because I've got the thing that I want to do that I need to stay true to. So it's about kind of balancing between how much of that you do to show that you can do a bit, but don't do all. You can't do all. Someone just said you'll burn out. You can't do all. And just think, what's your... So for me, my thing is I want to leave a legacy of analysis that the next generation and that the generation in 200 years' time can tap into. That drives me every day. So it's like, what is it? What's your why? Find the thing that you think, I really want to do this, and everything else, put a bit of what they call blinkers around, and just filter it out. Do a little bit, but filter the rest out. Because there's only like so many hours in a day or whatever. It's a bit cliche, but...
An absolute final question, I promise. We will release you.
Okay, so I said yes to the statement about the question about bringing people from our community.
Can you lower your mask, please? We can't hear you.
Yeah. So used to wearing it. Yeah. So yes, bringing people from our communities into these educational spaces, absolutely. But I'd say, what would you say about how you then ensure the quality of experience for those people once they're in those institutions? Because it's all very well to say you want to increase the numbers of people from our communities, but do you want to increase the number of people from our communities at the expense of themselves and their ideas of themselves and possibly their mental health and things like that, you know? So what would you say to that in terms of trying to ensure that they have a positive experience which kind of speaks positively to them, you know, and their...
At the RSC, they have a mentoring scheme. So I'm an associate at the RSC. So every year I have a new young actor in the company, black actor, and I am their person for everything. You know, if they want to come and say, or, you know, they want to be funny, or I want to bring my boyfriend, or whatever it is. Or I've been cast in this part and I'm feeling about it, and everything. Or, you know, they want to talk about agents, or their mental health, or whatever it may be. I think that what's really hard in all the institutions where we feel that we are, you know, breaking new ground, or we're standing on ground that is not made for us, is you need to have someone alongside you. I would say, when institutions that want to do the work of opening the world to the world, usually because the world is funding them, they have a job of work to do too. They absolutely, you know, have a job of work to do, and I would say that there needs to be a body within each organisation that constantly is monitoring how they're doing with that. Because words are great, fine thoughts are great, even with the best will in the world, not everybody can see what's coming down the track, and I think there has to be a constant process of reflection and listening and go again. So that's on the institution side, but for the individual, there needs to be a process of buddying up. I really think that that's crucially important, because the feeling of being the only person in the room is exhausting, and it gets in the way of your work, and you're there to do your work and be your best self and have your life blossom. And that's all you should be there to do, and everything else should be there to support you in that endeavour.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, like, I just think that buddying, having a mentorship is so important. Like, when I started at Central, I was the first collaborative doctoral award they had for a black student looking at black work in the Black Plays Archive, and they explicitly were like, we need to diversify our student cohort, basically. Like, in kind of not so many words, that was basically what it was. And I kind of ended up, there were no people of colour that could supervise me in the institution, because the few that they did have had other people they were supervising, or they weren't specialists in what I'm doing. So my only supervisor who's black and colour, who's black, is in a different institution, and they're kind of my mentor. And there's, you know, other amazing people like that, and I think mentoring is so important to be able to guide students who are kind of the only one in that space, or the only one of like 3 people in that space, or whatever it is. But also for the institutions to actually listen to you, because I think a lot of institutions say they want you to come in and to do the work, but they might not necessarily want to listen to what you've got to say about the work you're doing and what needs to change. So I think that institutionally there needs to be a lot more kind of opening up of space, and I guess more like a reparative approach, in the sense of where you're actually engaging with the students, with the cohort, about what the issues are and what they actually think need to be happening differently. So like at the NT, for example, there's been a really much bigger kind of call for transparency around who they're hiring, how many writers of colour, how many specifically black writers they've got, how many black permanent staff members they've got, and last year that was like 6% permanent staff, and that was an increase from the year before, and that was an increase from the year before that, and that's a really, obviously a really small percentage, particularly with how diverse London is. And so there's been a bigger call for them to be more transparent. And I mean, last year they had their first deputy artistic director who was black, Clint Dyer, and Ola Anamshuan, who's a dramaturg, became an associate, and that wasn't happening before. And so I think there are small changes in that institution, small changes happening, but I think it's about holding people accountable, having mentorships, so people don't feel like they're alone, if they've got a community, and actually inviting and encouraging institutions to really be more reparative in how they're dealing with the people who they're asking to do the work. That's what I think, anyway.
A massive thank you to our wonderful panellists. Really fantastic to listen to you all. Thank you.